Time to move on. Light years and time.
Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. We're going to be looking at Indian tribal names in a different capacity. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the manifestation of tribal names used as surnames, and we're going to look at geographically where these names pop up. And so we're going to see which ones seem to be isolated to the Americas in terms of where you find that surname. And then we're going to also be looking at ones that are sort of branching out into the Americas and other places. And then interestingly, there are some Indian tribal names that are primarily manifested as surnames in places that are completely outside of America. And so if anyone has any theory about how that may have taken place or why that is the case, you can start a discussion on that in the comments section. So let's get started.
Even your memory bank never got this far.
And just as a reminder, although there are stereotypical depictions of people who are supposed to be American Indian, the phenotype is quite diverse, and so it varies from ethnic group or tribal group or clan group to the next clan group. And so you can't just depend on one stereotype in terms of understanding what American Indians, Indigenous Americans, Aboriginal Americans look like. Some individuals look like no other group on the planet. However, there are some that actually resemble other groups in other parts of the world. And there may be reasons for that. And as we go through some of these surnames that are related to tribal names, you might notice that when you think about it, that perhaps the groups that we are talking about actually look like the individuals in the geographic spaces that you particularly find the name. Next up, we have the Powhatan with a very similar dynamic. You have approximately 27 people bearing this surname. Again, most prevalent in the United States and highest density in the United States. This suggests that this particular racial group, this family group, is concentrated in the United States. There is very little indication that they may have originated elsewhere. They appear to be indigenous, sort of growing up out of this land along with the Choctaw and other groups. Now we're going to go through these pretty quickly. We're not going to spend time doing a lot of analysis in terms of why these surnames may be found in particular places. So this is just a discussion about notation. And then if you want to go on and do a little bit more research on this, or you want to do a little bit more theorizing, you can. We are going to do a follow-up to this very quickly related to actual people with these surnames in the Americas, and we're going to be looking at how they have been classified racially. And so that will be pretty interesting in terms of giving a little bit more explanation to this dynamic that we are seeing in terms of geography and the surnames and the tribal names. And so for this particular Indian group, this is really interesting because this Indian group, you just have 5 people bearing this surname, but this is most prevalent in the United States and the highest density is in the United States. And I believe this is pronounced Keshan Indian group, and you have 5 of them. And so this appears to be a group that is either named the way they are named because they really are the first people, or they are named this way and they just don't relate to any other groups outside of the Americas in terms of close relations. But this particular group appears to be what would be considered an indigenous group. They are first here, and then you don't find this particular surname in a lot of other places. Now with the Chitimacha, you only find one individual bearing this surname, and this surname is in the United States. Now the Choctaw have a unique dynamic going on because they really appear to be centered in the United States in terms of origin. So for the Choctaw, you have 32 individuals bearing this surname, this tribal name as the surname. And then you have it most prevalent in the United States and the highest density in the United States. And so as far as Indian groups go, the Choctaw really appear to be very much indigenous to this particular land space. Now, we also looked at Choctaw not only as a surname, but as a forename. And so there are 16 individuals with this forename, again, focused right here in the United States. And so again, this is a unique dynamic for the Choctaw, when you will see how unique this is when you start to see some other Indian groups and how they appear to be seeded in other places or originating somewhere else. And so that surname, tribal name is shared pretty far and wide. But for the Choctaw in particular, you see this really heavy focus in terms of the United States. And here we see with the Chippewa Indians a similar dynamic. There are 129 individuals bearing this tribal name as the surname, and this is most prevalent in the United States with the highest density in the United States. And remember, along with the other groups that we've been talking about, Africa, Europe, when someone has a particular tribal group, and that's the family name, the tribal name, the clan name, that is the race of the people. And so people have been identifying individuals who are indigenous to the Americas as that in and of itself is a race. However, the same thing applies, because race is about the family. It's about those genetics, and all of the people in these different groups are not genetically linked. And some of them, did not even, you'll see as we go along that some groups appear to have roots in another place. And so for these, however, you can see that these races of people, the Chippewa race, the Choctaw race, the Saginaw race, there is this heavy rooting in the United States, and also the branches not really going beyond the United States. Following up the Choctaw, we have the Kickapoo, and again, they have 17 individuals bearing the surname of the tribe. And again, you have most prevalent in the United States, highest density in the United States. This again appears to be a tribal name that is really restricted to the United States, suggesting a high likelihood that they really are not spread out anywhere else, and they really are focused here as an indigenous group. Doing a forename analysis for the Chickasaw revealed something interesting. Now again, highest prevalence in the United States, highest density in the United States. This may just indicate a relocation of sorts, or just a transporting of this forename, meaning the first name. And so you see 4 in terms of incidents in the United States, and then 1 in Vietnam. And so that's pretty interesting. But again, this particular tribal group, this race of people, the Chickasaw, they appear to be very firmly rooted in the Americas, in the United States, in terms of roots and in terms of branches. And here we have a similar dynamic with the Yamasee. There are approximately 2 people bearing this tribal name as the surname. And again, this focus in the United States, you're not finding this particular tribal name in other parts of the world. And so, as not to do any disrespect to this tribal name, we're going to spell it. It's Cahuilla. And you have 3 individuals bearing this name as a surname. And this again is most prevalent in the United States. This is very important again, because this suggests that this really is the native home for these individuals. And it also suggests that you're not going to find a significant number of people from this tribal group outside of the United States. And this gets really amplified when you look at the Saginaw Indians, and you see again most prevalent in the United States and highest density in the United States, and there are 117 individuals bearing this tribal name as their surname. Now we see a little bit of spread here. Now with the Ottawa Indians, you have approximately 462 individuals bearing this tribal name as a surname, most prevalent in Canada and highest density in Canada. So you see the concentration again in the Americas, so concentration in North America, specifically in Canada. And here you have the Tuscarora surname for the Tuscarora Indians. Again, this is prevalent in Canada, most prevalent in Canada, and the highest density in Canada in terms of this particular racial group. Now the Comanche have a little bit more spread. You see that there are 100 people bearing the surname Comanche, that tribal name, as their surname. So there are 100 people, most prevalent in the United States, but again, this one is a little bit more spread out. So this is highest density in Venezuela. Still, we are talking about a tribal group, a racial group that appears to be, in terms of the surname usage, restricted to the Americas. Now the Caddo surname, tribal name, is pretty interesting. You have 175 people bearing this surname. The concentration appears to be in the United States in terms of most prevalent. Then you have the highest density in Canada. However, the discussion about the Caddo surname is very interesting, and this goes along with some assertions that Irish historians have been making about the idea that the ancient Irish people and the American Indians are one and the same. So you see this Caddo surname, which is also the Caddo Indian group, but you also see that this Caddo surname traces right back to Europe. And so there are a few questions about this. And it could be that the indigenous people, many of them, are coming from another place in the world and then seeding here, and then you're not really seeing as much in terms of population in other places. And so you see the Caddo surname, interestingly, relates to dub, which means black. This surname is very interesting, and this tribal name is very interesting because there are a number of tribal groups with names that sound very similar. Washita, Wichita, Wichita. And so this is one of those. And so for this particular one, you see the prevalence in Brazil, highest density in Brazil, again, concentrated here in the Americas with this particular spelling. This is where things begin to turn in a very interesting direction. And so you have the Taino surname, which comes from the Taino group. So you have this tribal name, and then you have the surname of individuals from this tribal group name. Now it's a large number. You have 947 individuals, most prevalent in Brazil. And so that's consistent with what you would expect. But then you have the highest density in the American Samoa. And so that's very interesting in terms of that dispersion. Things continue being interesting here with the Seneca, and you see that there are 2,646 individuals holding the Seneca surname, which is the tribal name, most prevalent in the United States. But then you have the highest density in Monaco. Here you see a dynamic with the Cherokee surname, that tribal name used as a surname, with 76 individuals bearing this surname, most prevalent in the United States, but you have the highest density in Mauritius. This may be related to a settler colonizer dynamic that's related again to the Moriscos and Marranos, because there is a significant amount of research suggesting that the Cherokee have more eastern roots. And here is an unexpected result. You have the Iowa Indians, 49 individuals with this tribal surname. However, this name is most prevalent in Papua New Guinea and also highest density in New Guinea. And as things continue to turn in a very interesting direction, we're looking at the Miami Indians. And what's interesting here is you have the highest prevalence for the Miami Indians in terms of that surname usage in Iran. You also have the highest density in Iran. And if you look on the screen, you have 519 approximately with this tribal surname. You see 353 in Iran. The next is Democratic Republic of the Congo at 55, and then you don't get to the Americas until number 3 with Brazil, and then after that it jumps right back out to Indonesia and Greece. So this is a very interesting development in terms of who is using this tribal name as the surname. And here we have another oddity. We have the Washita, and 175 people are bearing this surname, this tribal name as a surname. But again, very interestingly, this is most prevalent in Indonesia, again with the highest density in Indonesia. Moving right along, we have an Indian tribal group, Karuk. 984 individuals are bearing this tribal name as a surname. What's really odd is these individuals, it's most prevalent in the Ukraine, and the highest density is in the Ukraine.
Time to move on. Light years and time.
Now we move on to the Arawak. This is distinct from the Taino in terms of how this surname is used. So you only see one individual bearing this particular surname, this tribal name as a surname. But interestingly, it's most prevalent. It exists in India. Now let's look at the Hopi surname. You can see that for this tribal name used as a surname, it's most prevalent in Indonesia, then in North Macedonia, then followed by Israel, Papua New Guinea, Niger, Cameroon, Russia, South Africa, Iran, all of that before you get to the United States. And here we have another one of those oddities. We have the Wichita Indians. This surname usage is most prevalent in Thailand. Here we have another interesting Indian group dynamic, and this is with the Cheyenne Indians, and this is similar to what takes place in terms of the Cherokee. So you have 28 individuals bearing this particular tribal name as a surname, most prevalent in Israel, then followed by Lebanon, highest density in Israel. This is really interesting because there's no clear understanding as to why this would be taking place, particularly since individuals from Israel were not considered the colonizers or settlers for the Cheyenne Indian area. And we have a similar dynamic with the Navajo Indians. You have 567 individuals bearing this tribal name as a surname, most prevalent in Spain, highest density in Spain. This again is pointing to a colonizer-settler dynamic, but it's unclear as to whether the Spanish actually simply gave this name to the people that are now known as Navajo, and it was a part of their own language structure, or there was a colonizer dynamic going on, perhaps, where you have settlers who then take on the identity of an Indian group. So there are a number of possibilities for why this may take place. Here we have another similar dynamic with the Tunica Indians. You see 144 individuals bearing this name as a surname, most prevalent again in Spain, highest density in Spain. This is really interesting. You have the Homa Indians, primarily in Louisiana, and there are 4,303 people bearing this tribal name as a surname. But interestingly, it's most prevalent in Cameroon, with the highest density in Cameroon. There's no clear-cut explanation for why this may be taking place, particularly when you look and see that the next place in terms of prevalence is Algeria, followed by Niger, followed by Morocco, France, Solomon Islands, Senegal, Ivory Coast, before you ever get to the United States. So there may be something going on with the Homa history that's not clear on the surface based upon this dynamic, because you definitely don't have Cameroon as a colonizer or as a settler, unless, of course, you were talking about perhaps Marano-Morisco dynamics. And here you have a tribal group, UTE. This tribal name is pronounced a number of ways. This is, again, very interesting. 2,124 individuals bearing this surname, and most prevalent in Nigeria, highest density in Papua New Guinea. Next, we have the Oto Indian group with 136 individuals bearing this surname. Again, interesting dynamic. This surname usage is most prevalent in Nigeria, followed by the highest density in the Solomon Islands. And we're continuing on with this interesting dynamic related to Nigeria and the American Indians. So you see approximately 6 individuals bear the Lenape surname. And that tribal group, that prevalence in terms of the surname, you see it's most prevalent in Nigeria, again with the highest density in Nigeria. Again, it's unclear as to why this surname would be most prevalent in Nigeria. There is a lot of concern, controversy about the history of the Lenape. And so there may need to be a little bit more research done in terms of the history of the Lenape and perhaps some connection to Nigeria, people in Nigeria that is not clear on the surface. Again, this may be a dynamic that is related to the Morisco settling process. And finally, we have the Osage Indians. This is really interesting too, because there are 288 individuals bearing this surname, most prevalent in Nigeria, highest density in Nigeria, then followed by the United States. It's unclear how this actually took place. You may have a dynamic where you have roots somewhere else and then the branches ended up in the United States, or you may have a process whereby individuals start in the United States and for whatever reason those branches ended up in other places, and there may be a claim to the name, the surname, the tribal name, as a way to definitely hold on to the heritage in terms of the roots. It's also important to keep in mind that some of these tribal names as surnames may be spread far and wide. They may be widely dispersed because of a process of enslavement or deportation of American Indians. And so what would happen in that case is that you would have the surnames traveling with the people. And so you might find those surnames, those tribal names, in places that are far from the original place of the people.
Time to move on. Light years and time.
As we wrap this up, we have examined a number of tribal names used as surnames, and we found that in terms of the American Indians, many of these tribal names used as surnames are found right here in the Americas, but an odd dynamic also surfaced where you see the tribal names used as surnames appearing all over the world. Some of that might be related to colonizer or settler dynamics, but that's not completely clear. So if anyone actually belongs to one of these tribal groups and you have some understanding about how this branching or rooting process took place, please share that in the discussion so that we can all become enlightened. We're going to be finishing up with another section where we're going to actually be looking at historical records of individuals with the actual Indian surnames, and we're going to be looking at how they have been classified racially. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.